Stephen Sanders lived in a small town in northern Oregon. Like his father, the man was a ranger in the Detachment for the Protection of Conservation Areas from the criminal actions of poachers. Stephen lived with his wife and 5-year-old son in a small house almost at the very edge of the forest. The young ranger valued fairness more than anything else in the world and was ready to defend the lives of the forest inhabitants to his last breath. Stephen knew his way around the traps set by other poachers, and therefore he always neutralized them in time. That was one of the reasons that many hunters disliked him, as Stephen deprived them of their income from poaching. Stephen made daily rounds of the area, never taking days off, even in bad weather. That winter in Oregon turned out to be very snowy, and therefore the young ranger used a snowmobile to inspect his territory. The ranger liked making new tracks in the fresh snow, cutting through the snow dunes, and listening to the noise of the engine running at full power. One day, during his rounds, Stephen was moving at a slow pace along the snow-covered narrow path when he saw something strange ahead of him. The man took a closer look and realized it was the body of some kind of animal. Stephen immediately turned off the engine and carefully got off the snowmobile. He came closer and saw that there was a she-wolf lying on the left side of the track. She wasn't showing any signs of life. Her back was covered in blood, which had already frozen in the cold. Poor thing. Another victim of the poacher's greed. Stephen thought sadly. Seeing the dead wolf was very painful. The young ranger knew that the gray predator could have fallen victim not only to poachers, but even to regular hunters who considered wolves dangerous and harmful animals. The fact was that many of the town residents kept sheep and were very afraid of attacks of the forest predators. That was why the hunters got the support of the local authorities to hunt down the wolves. Unfortunately, they did it despite Stephen's protests, refusing to take his opinion into account for some reason. Of course, the young ranger did his best to protect the forest inhabitants, but the hunting parties still managed to harm the predators sometimes, and there were now very few of them left in the region. Apparently, this she-wolf was unlucky enough to get in the way of the ruthless killers, who felt invincible thanks to their support from the mayor's office. Realizing what had happened, Stephen sighed sadly and decided to take the body of the dead predator with him, so as to not leave it to be torn to pieces by crows and ferrets. The young ranger loaded the wolf's body onto the snowmobile and set off towards the town. Stephen was going to bury the predator in a special place in the wasteland, which was within walking distance from the ranger's house. When the man drove up to his house, his little son Tony jumped out into the street to meet his father. Dad, what's that you got there? Did you find a dog?" the boy asked, looking at the snow-covered fur of the forest predator. "That's no dog, that's a wolf. Unfortunately, she's already dead. She got killed in the forest," Stephen said sadly, lowering his eyes. "Wow, a real wolf? Like the one from the Little Red Riding Hood?" Tony whispered enthusiastically and walked closer to the snowmobile. Stephen smiled ironically and then headed to the shed to get a shovel to bury the she-wolf. But before he had the time to take even a dozen steps, Tony started shouting, Dad, come back quickly. She's alive. Do you hear me? She's alive." Stephen turned around and then walked quickly towards the snowmobile. "Look, her eyelids are moving, and steam is coming out of her mouth," Tony added. At first, the young ranger thought that his son was joking. "But I saw it myself. She was dead. That's impossible," flashed through Stephen's head. However, when the ranger looked more closely, he realized that his son was right. The she-wolf really was alive, although she was holding on with the last of her breath. Stephen quickly picked up the forest predator and brought her back inside the house. There he spread a blanket and laid her close to the fireplace. Then the man took out the first aid kit and carefully treated the gunshot wound on the wolf's back. At this time, the forest predator behaved calmly and lay almost motionless, as if realizing that the human was trying to help her. "Well, that's better," Stephen whispered, covering the she-wolf with a warm blanket. The young ranger understood that he had done everything he could and the rest was in God's hands. Now, little Tony and his mother Catherine had a lot more responsibilities, since it was them who had to take care of the rescued wolf. At first, the forest predator refused to eat anything, and the food left by Tony remained untouched. The she-wolf teetered on the brink of death for several days. Sometimes it even seemed to Stefan that she wouldn't pull through. Then, one day, the ranger knelt down in front of the predator and started stroking her, whispering affectionate words. Of course, Stefan couldn't see the tears in the wolf's half-closed eyes at the time. About 3 days later, the forest guests touched the food for the first time, which caused a storm of joyful emotions in Tony and his parents. Now the boy literally never left the wolf's side and even gave her a name. Looking at how Tony took care of the she-wolf, Stefan was incredibly glad that love for animals lived in his son's heart. About a week later, Greta got up on her feet and left the house for the first time. Swaying slightly from side to side because of the wound, the she-wolf walked around the yard and then, having sniffed every corner of it, returned to her place next to the fireplace. As Stefan watched her go outside and walk around, he was 100% sure that the gray predator would go into the forest and never return. But Greta surprised the young ranger once again. She decided to stay in his house. Of course, Tony was very happy about it, as he would now be able to play with the she-wolf as much as he'd like to. But the real reason why Greta decided to stay at the ranger's house became clear much later, when it was already spring outside. The fact was that when the snow melted and it got warm outside, Stefan noticed that the sides of the she-wolf had gotten noticeably rounded. "Oh wow, my dear, you're pregnant," the young ranger whispered gently, touching the predator's belly. As if to confirm Stefan's suspicion, he felt something push at him from inside the wolf's belly, causing the mother-to-be to growl softly. There were tears in the man's eyes, which came running down his face a moment later. Now Stefan treated Greta with even more care, always giving her extra food, realizing that she was eating for her future offspring too. About a week later, Greta gave birth to 5 fluffy wolf pups. "Dad, now we will have a whole family of wolves!" Tony exclaimed with joy, picking up the pups one by one. "Son, I don't mind the pups living with us, but you need to remember that they're predators who belong in the wild," Stefan answered. The ranger understood that sooner or later, Greta would lead her family back into the forest. But until it happened, the ranger allowed his son to play with the wolf pups, who behaved like ordinary domestic dogs. At the same time, Stefan tried to keep secret the fact that an entire wolf family was now living in his yard. The young ranger knew that it was unlikely that his neighbors and other residents of the town would be happy about it. The fact was that the majority of the townspeople always saw wolves as ruthless, bloodthirsty predators and should be exterminated. Therefore, Stefan did his best to keep Greta a secret, especially after she had her pups in his house. Time passed, and the pups grew bigger and bigger, to the great delight of Tony and his parents. Squealing and whimpering joyfully, the fluffy animals played with the boy for days on end and became like brothers to him. Unfortunately, Tony was too young to understand that not all people love animals. Once, when the boy went to the store with his mother, he met his friend and told him all about the 6 wolves living in his house. Tony couldn't have known what the consequences would be. He simply wanted to share his joy with all his friends. Soon, rumors spread around the city that Stefan Sanders had sheltered a pack of wolves in his yard. Moreover, the local residents started to get worried that their livestock would be endangered when the young ranger's wolves would be released. "They grew up among people, so they aren't afraid of us. They know our habits and will have no problem attacking our sheep," said one of the hunters who disliked wolves passionately. Realizing that Greta and her offspring were in great danger, Stefan decided to take his great tenants farther into the forest. The she-wolf looked into the ranger's eyes and calmly got into his pickup truck, having understood that the ranger was trying to save her yet again. Little Tony said goodbye to the grown pups and hugged Greta with tears in his eyes. The boy understood that the animals would be better off in the forest, which would become their home for the rest of their lives. When Stefan took Greta and her pups into the forest, the gray predators got visibly agitated and started breathing heavily, drawing in the fresh air, smelling of pine needles. "Well, you're home now," the ranger said, letting the wolves out of his pickup truck. The pups happily jumped out and began to fool around in the forest clearing, and only Greta stayed behind to rub her nose against the young ranger's hand, after which she walked slowly towards the nearest grove. Soon, the she-wolf and her family disappeared into the bushes, and Stefan started the truck and drove home. The man was feeling awful, but he had no other choice. And when he turned onto the road leading to his house, he saw a crowd of hunters with guns. They stopped Stefan and demanded for him to give them the she-wolf and her cubs. But the young ranger defiantly opened the gate and made it clear that no one was in the yard. Many of the hunters were very angry with Stefan for releasing the tame wolves in the forest. But Stefan didn't pay any attention to their criticism, knowing deep down that Greta and her offspring would never harm people. A week passed, then a month, and then a whole year. To the surprise of the locals, no one attacked their sheep. Moreover, the hunters couldn't believe it, but they hadn't seen a single wolf in the region during that whole year. And only Stefan knew that the wise Greta, wanting to thank her savior, took the wolf pack to other lands, where the locals weren't afraid of predators and didn't want to wipe them off the face of the earth.